Hi everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back. It's Monday, and that means another episode of Mondays with Margaret. Today is also a holiday where I live. We are celebrating Family Day, so for all of you who are also celebrating, I hope that you have been able to connect with your family in some way this year. In today's episode, we will be talking about Margaret Atwood's fourth novel, Life Before Man. Life Before Man was originally published in 1979, and it's written in a different way than Atwood's previous novels. I will talk about how it's written, the characters, themes, and give a very brief synopsis of the story. I won't give any spoilers away, so you don't have to worry about that if you haven't read it. And I'm going to start, I think, with the structure of the novel. It's divided into 5 parts. The first part takes place over the last 3 days in October in 1976. We are introduced to the main characters and start to get a sense of their lives. Part 2 is November and December of 1976, and most of the themes are clear by the end of this part. Part 3 is January and February 1977. The story gets a bit more fleshed out. And part 4 is from March 9th to July 9th of 1977, and here we see a lot more movement happen and relationships change. And then the 5th and final part is from September 3rd, 1977 to August 1978, where the changes become more permanent and we see where everyone ends up. The story is told by 3 different characters, alternating every chapter. First is Elizabeth, second her husband Nate, and third is Elizabeth's co-worker Lesha. And I liked the different point of views, but I was surprised it wasn't written in first person. It was written in third person, and I wondered why Atwood did this, and I'm sure she had her reasons for doing this. I just find that the third person keeps us more distant from the characters, which brings me to talking about the characters. So I've said about Atwood's previous novels that I never felt really connected to her characters, and this is true for me here as well. However, I do like that they were better developed. I didn't like any of them, but I don't think I was supposed to. I don't think that Atwood, really cares if we like her characters or not. I think she cares more about the topics that she is bringing up in her novels. So we have Elizabeth, who is married to Nate, and they have 2 young daughters, Janet and Nancy. And then Elizabeth's lover, Chris, has died by suicide, and she is grieving when the novel begins. And in fact, I want to read the first few paragraphs of the book because I think it will give you a good sense of the writing, which I think is exceptional. And I've said many times before that, I love Atwood's use of metaphors and descriptions, and this is true here as well. So this is on page 3, just as the story is beginning, and this is from Elizabeth's perspective. I don't know how I should live. I don't know how anyone should live. All I know is how I do live. I live like a peeled snail, and that's no way to make money. I want that shell back. It took me long enough to make. You've got it with you wherever you are. You were good at removing. I want a shell like a sequin dress, made of silver nickels and dimes and dollars overlapping like the scales of an armadillo, armored dildo, impermeable like a French raincoat. I wish I didn't have to think about you. You wanted to impress me. Well, I'm not impressed. I'm disgusted. That was a disgusting thing to do, childish and stupid. A tantrum smashing a doll, but what you smashed was your own head, your own body. You wanted to make damn good and sure I'd never be able to turn over in bed again without feeling that body beside me. Not there, but tangible, like a leg that's been cut off. Gone, but the place still hurts. You wanted me to cry, mourn, sit in a rocker with a black-edged handkerchief, bleeding from the eyes. But I'm not crying. I'm angry. I'm so angry I could kill you if you hadn't already done that for yourself. So I just found this opening to be very descriptive and also emotional of, we don't really know exactly everything that's going on at first, obviously, but just what Elizabeth is going through and how she describes her anger and how frustrated she is in this grief. Elizabeth's past is a bit of a mystery, and no one really knows all of it, and she sees this as being to her advantage. So we know that she's had a difficult childhood, and we do eventually learn about her mother and her sister and her horrible Aunt Muriel that Elizabeth hates. And I found that Elizabeth wants independence, but she also wants someone to depend on. And that might be true of all of the characters, and they can't figure out how to have it both ways. On page 163, Elizabeth describes her independence, as it shows the friction between that wanting independence but not wanting the independence. So the last paragraph on page 163, she stands up, turns the key in her desk. She has backbone. She has money in the bank, not enough, but some. She does not have to depend. She is not a dependent. She is self-supporting. Sorry about that, a few books just fell. So she says this, and then not too long later, she says, but I haven't had anyone to help me in a long time. So it just shows how there's this duality, which I'll talk about a little bit more because that's another theme throughout the book. Nate is Elizabeth's husband, and he feels that Elizabeth blames him for Chris's death. Nate seems to be a very nurturing man. He's a caring father, and he is having an affair with Martha. And it becomes clear very early on that Elizabeth and Nate's marriage has been in trouble for a very long time, and they are living together for the sake of the children. Nate was a lawyer, and now he makes wooden toys in their basement. And then the third main character is Lesha, who works at the ROM with Elizabeth. And Lesha's job is her identity in many ways. And then there's Lesha's boyfriend, William, who she seems kind of ambivalent about. So the story starts out messy, and it only gets messier as Nate wants to start a relationship with Lesha. And they eventually have an affair. And all of this while still wanting to keep everything as normal as possible, which of course isn't possible. The story is about how they navigate these relationships. The story takes place in Toronto, and if you know Toronto at all, especially Queen's Park and the ROM, which is the Royal Ontario Museum, then you will recognize many places. Atwood kind of directs you through these different Toronto streets and places seamlessly. So before I get into all of the themes, I thought that I would mention the title, Life Before Man. So it could mean a number of things. It could mean specifically Elizabeth's life before Nate or Chris, but I think it has more to do with the connections between us as humans and nature. So there are several times throughout the book that animal behavior, specifically dinosaurs because of the ROM, are compared with human behavior, and I love this. So on page 14, there's a description from Lesha where she talks about this. So Lesha says, in prehistory, there are no men, no other human beings, unless it's the occasional lone watcher like herself, tourist or refugee, hunched in his private fern with his binoculars, minding his own business. And then there's another spot as well. On page 164, it's from Lesha's point of view, and she talks about this as well. Organisms adapt to their environments, of necessity most of the time. They also adapt to their own needs, often with a certain whimsy. You could almost say perversity. So we see the characters in this novel continuously trying to adapt to the new things that they have placed themselves in, the new situations, the new relationships. They're constantly having to change the way that they think and how they operate. In this novel, we see many themes that we have seen before, death, and specifically in this novel, suicide. The story begins with us finding out that Chris has died by suicide, and we also learn of deaths that happened before the story in the novel, and then there is a death that occurs in the novel. And suicide is brought up by many times by, I think all three main characters talk about it, as well as a couple secondary characters. Elizabeth wonders a few times if she wants to die. And at one point, Lesha talks about understanding how Chris could have done what he did. And as many of you may already know, Atwood always includes drowning in some way, and that is true in this novel as well. Elizabeth says a couple of times that, someone can drown in 2 inches of water, and there are reasons why she worries about this. Mental illness is brought up with some of the minor characters, and Elizabeth goes into depression. And then obviously grief, and how Elizabeth deals with Chris's death is the obvious one. But there is also the grief of relationships that have ended, whether the characters admit to their end or not. And each character deals with their grief and denial in different ways. On page 157, Elizabeth talks about how her grief concerning Chris has shifted. And I thought it was interesting that she was able to recognize that in herself. It says, then this is from Elizabeth's perspective, she can now think Chris's death. She almost never thinks Chris's suicide. This would imply that Chris's death was something he did to himself. She thinks of it, on the contrary, as something he did to her. He's not feeling the effect of it, whereas she still is. For instance, she has not opened the desk until now because in the upper left-hand pigeonhole, held together tidily by an elastic band, is the bundle of letters he was sending her in September and October, all on lined notebook paper and ballpoint pen. Marriage, separation, and divorce is another theme that often comes up in Atwood's novels, and this book is all about this. Elizabeth and Nate's marriage has fallen apart before the novel even begins, and we watch the two of them continue to change the boundaries of their relationship, which is mind-boggling sometimes to read about. But I think on page 192, Nate talks about the differences in his relationship with Elizabeth and Lesha, and I found it very interesting the way he distinguishes them. Sadly, Nate stacks plates. It's the rule that when Elizabeth cooks, Nate does the dishes. One of the many rules, sub-rules, codicils, addenda, errata, living with Elizabeth involves a maze of such legalities, no easier to understand because some of them are unspoken. Like an unwary pedestrian, he only realizes he's violated one of these when the bumper hits him, the whistle blows, the big hand descends. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. He imagines Lesha to be without rules. And I think that this is where a lot of Nate's issues are, and that he sees, that there's no rules. If you've been in any relationship, you know there's always rules, whether they're spoken or not. And I don't know if it's whether he thinks that there's no rules or that he sees rules as a bad thing, but I think regardless, it causes him a lot of issues. The separation for Nate is described as living dual lives, especially as his relationship with Lesha gets more serious. And this is described so well on page 295. And I'm just going to go to that. He thought that by moving to Lesha's, he could rid himself of the need to be in 2 places at once. But he's still spending almost as much time at his old house as at the new house. Lesha isn't supposed to know this, but she behaves as if she does anyway. He should have 2 sets of clothes, 2 identities, 1 for each house. It's the lack of this extra costume or body that is cracking him apart. He knew in advance, in theory, that separation is painful. He did not know it would also be literal. He has been separated. He is separate, dismembered. He is no longer a member. This theme of separation also comes up with the country of Canada itself. The elections in Quebec are brought up and the politics around that. So when this story takes place, René Lévesque was the premier of Quebec, and he was with the Parti Québécois, which started the first Quebec referendum. And they had the citizens vote to decide to either leave Canada or stay a part of the country. So this is brought up a number of times, which also is about separation and even divorce in some ways. Obviously, a main theme is relationships. In this case, all of them are super crazily unhealthy. Everyone is connected in some way, and if they are not, Elizabeth makes sure that they are. It's quite muddy, but relationships can be muddy. And Atwood describes manipulation and revenge in very subtle ways. Nate's character describes the games and schemes that adults play in relationships, and this starts on page 236. He's supposed to be packing. He meant to pack. He's been meaning to pack. He has peddled a stack of cardboard boxes home from the supermarket and bought a roll of strong twine. He has collected newspapers for wrapping. They've been in a neat pile at the foot of the cellar stairs for 2 weeks. He's even taken some sandpaper and a box of mixed nails and screws to Lesha's and left it in the front room as a pledge of his good intentions. He's explained to her that he wants to proceed gradually. First, he'll tell Elizabeth he's decided to move his workshop to a larger, brighter space. She'll be surprised he can afford it, but he can get through that. Then he'll tell the children the same thing. After they're no longer used to having him around all the time, he will, by slow degrees, stop sleeping at one house and start sleeping at the other. He wants to make the actual break imperceptible to them, he said. He fully intends to implement this plan, but with a crucial difference. He doesn't think he needs to discuss with Lesha. He wants to wait until Elizabeth asks him, or even orders him to leave. It will save a lot of trouble later if he can give her the impression she's making the decision herself. He isn't yet sure how he was going to arrange this. Meanwhile, he has to cope with Lesha's obvious and growing depression. She hasn't been putting any pressure on him, any spoken pressure. Nevertheless, he can scarcely breathe. For 3 weeks now, he's been running up the cellar stairs when he hears the children come home from school, so he can act cheerful and unconcerned and make them warm milk and peanut butter sandwiches. He tells them jokes, cooks them dinner, reads them longer and longer bedtime stories. Last night, they said they were tired and would he please turn out the light. Wounded, Nate wanted to fling his arms wide, cry out, "I won't be with you much longer," but surely the point is to avoid such histrionics. He darkened the room, kissed them goodnight, went to the bathroom to put a hot washcloth over his eyes. Already his reflection in the mirror was fading. The house was forgetting him. He was negligible. He blotted his eyes and went to hunt down Elizabeth. This is also part of his scheme. He makes a point of trying to have an inconsequential chat with her at least every 2 days, giving her openings, chances. So in this story, Nate is not the only one who plays these games. Every single one of the characters, I think, plays some kind of games. But I thought that description of it, and he's so aware of the fact that he's doing it, was very interesting. Identity is another theme that Atwood has had in all of her novels. Lesha's identity is very much around her job, and I also think that her character is used as a symbol of multiculturalism. They talk about her Jewishness and her Ukrainian language. It's also part of her connection to the museum. And her character also represents being an immigrant and being different. For Nate, as he begins a new relationship with Lesha, he changes his identity. He shaves his face. And when he does this, he sees this as kind of transforming himself. And then there's also the theme of being disconnected from their bodies. Elizabeth has this where she, can't hear, so she goes to the doctor. Her doctor says her ears are fine, and she's hearing this constant humming, and then she realizes that the sound is coming from somewhere else. Elizabeth describes her relationship with her body, which I found very interesting, and this is on page 96. Elizabeth lies propped in the bathtub. Once she took baths for pleasure. Now she takes them for the same reason she eats. She's servicing her body like servicing a car, keeping it well cleaned, its moving parts in trim, ready for the time when she may be able to use it again, inhabit it. For pleasure, she's eating too much, she knows that, but better too much than too little. Too little is the danger. She's lost the capacity to judge. Since she's never really hungry, no doubt she's taken too many baths as well. So there's this whole idea of not being part of her body. She doesn't feel like she's inhabiting it. Forgiveness is a theme in this novel that I don't know that we've seen in the others. Many of the characters are seeking forgiveness. Elizabeth chooses to forgive her Aunt Muriel. Forgiveness is sought in Elizabeth and Nate's relationship and with Nate and Lesha's relationship. There are also a few descriptions in the book that reminded me of The Edible Woman. Starting from page 6, this is, I think, Elizabeth, who, there's a description about food. Elizabeth used to cook, very well too. It was at the same time as her interest in rugs. She still cooks. She peels some things and heats others. Some things harden, others become softer. White turns to brown. It goes on. But when she thinks about food, she doesn't see the bright colors, red, green, orange, featured in the gourmet cookbook. Instead, she sees the food as illustrations from those magazine articles that show how much fat there is in your breakfast. Dead white eggs, white strips of bacon, white butter, chickens, roasts, and steaks modeled from bland lard. That's what all food tastes like to her now. Nevertheless, she eats. She overeats, weeding herself down. There's also an example later on where she's eating a waffle and then she can't eat the waffle and she remembers why, and it was very edible woman-esque. Atwood also brings up poetry and Canadian literature in this novel, and this wouldn't have been too long after she surprised Canadians by saying that there was Canadian literature with her book Survival. So the two poems that are mentioned are the war poem In Flanders Field, and she makes sure to say that it's written by a Canadian, which I loved. The other poem is Trees by Joyce Kilmer, and I love that poem. And then Canadian literature is used in a parlor game when Elizabeth throws a dinner party. So I thought that was kind of neat that she kind of did this nod to Canadian literature. For me, the best part of the book was the writing. Atwood's writing, I think, is becoming even better as we read further along. And I've become to expect a lot of the themes, so they were not really a surprise. And I did appreciate that I felt I knew these characters better. I still wish that there was more of a connection that I felt for them in some way. That's the piece that is still missing for me. I will say that I was surprised that the character I felt the most for was Nate, and that's not to say that I liked him or approved of his actions, but if I had to pick one character, he'd be it. Lesha drove me absolutely bananas. I know some people have said that this book is about an open marriage, and I don't agree. I think the book is about a marriage that has been falling apart for quite some time. Perhaps I'm wrong, and in that, I don't know what Atwood's thoughts were about that, but I'd be interested in your take on it as well. So I have put the reading schedule for this series in the description box below, and you will probably notice that next week we will be finishing up February with 3 children's books from Margaret Atwood. So that'll be something different, and again, we'll see a different side of Margaret Atwood. So please let me know what you thought of Life Before Man. What did you think of the characters, the stories, and themes? I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.